The cabin that hid a secret dust, bullets, and revenge. Emily Carter had always been drawn to quiet places, the kind of spaces where the world seemed to slow down and old stories hid behind every shadow. She was a historian by training, but an explorer at heart, someone who believed that even the smallest details could reveal the most extraordinary truths. That summer, she found herself driving along winding dirt roads deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a place she had chosen because it promised solitude and a sense of mystery. Her plan was simple: research old family records in small towns and learn about lives that time had nearly forgotten. She did not expect to find much beyond dusty books and fading photographs, but fate had something different in store. The mountains stretched endlessly around her, green and quiet, with the occasional call of a bird or rustle of leaves in the wind. Emily's car crunched over the gravel, and she felt a thrill she could not explain. There was something about being surrounded by untouched wilderness that made her feel closer to the past, as if the trees themselves held the secrets of those who had walked here long ago. She parked near a narrow trail that locals called Whispering Path, a place few ventured. A tangle of branches partly hid the entrance, giving it the air of a secret passage waiting to be discovered. She adjusted her backpack, checked her camera, and stepped out. The trail was rough but manageable, winding upward through dense forest. Sunlight pierced the canopy in golden streaks, illuminating the path and the thick undergrowth. Emily's eyes scanned constantly. She had learned that the smallest detail, a bent branch, an unusual stone, a forgotten marker, could hint at something hidden. After an hour of walking, she noticed something that made her heart beat faster: the outline of a small structure partially hidden by trees and shrubs. The roof was covered in moss, and the wooden walls had aged to a dull gray. From a distance, it looked like a forgotten relic, abandoned to the elements and time. As she approached, the air seemed to change. The forest quieted, and the usual sounds of birds and insects faded into an almost unnatural stillness. Emily slowed her steps, sensing that this was no ordinary cabin. She studied the outside carefully. The windows were intact but dirty, the door sagged slightly on its hinges, and the wood was weathered, marked with years of wind and rain. She could see faint scratches along the doorframe, perhaps from animals or maybe something else. Emily hesitated for a moment, her curiosity battling a subtle feeling of caution. Then she pushed the door open, the rusty hinges squealing in protest. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and earth, a dry, musty scent that spoke of decades without visitors. The sunlight streaming through cracks in the walls illuminated cobwebs in the corners and particles of dust floating like tiny stars. The floorboards were uneven, some warped with age, but the structure was surprisingly intact. On first glance, it seemed completely abandoned. Yet Emily noticed small signs that someone had been here more recently than the cabin's weathered appearance suggested. A chair was slightly off its usual position, as though moved by someone in a hurry. On a table near the corner lay a half-empty tin can of matches and a few scattered papers that seemed out of place. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the papers. They were letters, yellowed with age, with writing that had faded but remained legible. The ink was uneven, almost as if the writer had paused frequently, lost in thought or fear. Emily sat down carefully on the edge of a wooden bench, spreading the letters out before her. Each one told a fragment of a story that seemed both ordinary and deeply disturbing. At first, it appeared to be the record of a family's daily life, but as she read, she noticed references to arguments, threats, and tensions that hinted at something much darker. One letter spoke of a settling of old scores, another hinted at unforgiven mistakes, and another seemed to be written in warning, urging someone to leave the mountains before it was too late. Curiosity pushed Emily to explore further. She moved around the cabin slowly, her eyes scanning for hidden compartments or objects that might reveal more. Underneath a loose floorboard near the corner, she found a small journal, its leather cover worn and cracked. Opening it carefully, she discovered it belonged to a man named Thomas Granger. The first entries were mundane, notes about weather, hunting trips, and repairs around the cabin, but the tone shifted quickly. Granger wrote about disputes with neighbors, disputes that grew more bitter and personal over time. He described betrayals, family conflicts, and a series of events that led him to fear for his own safety. The deeper Emily read, the clearer it became that the journal was more than just personal reflection. It was a record of a life marked by fear, anger, and a need for justice as he saw it. The most chilling entries were those that spoke of violence, though Emily read them with careful attention, noting the restraint in the language. Granger wrote of seeing threats in every shadow, of hearing rumors of plans against him, and of preparing for the worst. There were passages that described hidden compartments in the cabin, weapons stored in secret, and codes written to track movements. Yet, even in these darker moments, there was a meticulousness, a precision that suggested he was not reckless but deliberate. Emily felt a mix of fear and fascination. She realized she had stumbled upon a life that had been lived in quiet tension, a life shaped by secrets and the weight of grudges that had stretched across years. She examined the rest of the cabin, finding more evidence of Granger's careful planning. Behind a false panel in the wall, there were old tools, bullets stored in small tin boxes, and a rifle that, while rusty, had obviously been maintained. Maps of the surrounding forest were pinned to the wall, with certain areas marked and circled repeatedly. It was clear that the cabin was not just a home but a sanctuary, a place where someone had prepared for confrontation while hiding from the world. Emily's heart raced. She knew she had found something significant, something that went beyond ordinary history. This was a story of tension, survival, and hidden truths, all preserved in dust, wood, and ink. She carefully photographed each discovery, taking detailed notes for her records. Even as she worked, she sensed the weight of the past pressing down on her. The cabin seemed alive with the echoes of Granger's life, as if the walls themselves remembered the choices he had made. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying a faint sound of movement, though she could see no one. The isolation of the mountains, the cabin's secrecy, and the history she was uncovering combined to create a feeling that was both thrilling and unsettling. Emily understood that she had entered a story that had been waiting for decades to be told, a story that demanded careful attention and respect. By the end of the day, Emily had gathered enough material to return to her car and study the findings more thoroughly. She knew that the cabin had been more than a forgotten building. It was a living record of a man's life shaped by conflict, secrecy, and perhaps revenge. As she walked back down the trail, she felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. She had uncovered the first layer of a mystery, but she knew there were deeper secrets hidden within the mountains, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Each step she took seemed to echo the footsteps of the past, and she felt a growing determination to understand the full story, no matter where it might lead. Back at her small rental cabin for the night, Emily spread out her notes and photographs on the table. The journal entries, letters, and hidden compartments told a story that felt almost cinematic in its intensity, yet it was undeniably real. She traced the names mentioned in the letters and the journal, discovering that some were still alive in nearby towns. The thought of these connections made her both cautious and eager. History, she realized, was not just about the past, but about the people who carried it forward. As the fire crackled in the stove, Emily felt a deep sense of purpose. She had found the beginning of a story that demanded to be told, a story of lives intertwined by secrecy, fear, and decisions made long ago. Even as she drifted to sleep that night, images of the cabin and its hidden corners filled her mind. Dust motes floated in the sunlight streaming through broken windows, shadows stretched across worn floorboards, and the voice of Thomas Granger seemed to whisper faintly from the pages of his journal. Emily knew that she had only uncovered the tip of the iceberg. The cabin, silent and forgotten to most, held secrets that could reshape what the nearby towns believed about their own history. And she had promised herself, silently, that she would follow every clue, document every discovery, and reveal the story that the mountains had been guarding for decades. After her first visit to the cabin, Emily Carter could not shake the feeling that she had stumbled upon something much bigger than she had imagined. Each detail she had uncovered, the letters, the journal, the hidden compartments, pushed her curiosity further. She spent that night in her small rental cabin, reading every word of Thomas Granger's journal again, trying to understand the man behind the handwriting. It was clear that he had lived a life of caution and careful observation, yet there were hints of a conflict so intense that it had changed everything around him. Emily felt a mix of fascination and unease. She knew that to understand the full story, she would have to dig deeper, tracing the people, places, and events that had shaped Granger's life. The next morning, Emily returned to the cabin with a notebook, a camera, and a small voice recorder. She wanted to capture everything: the tiniest scratches on the floorboards, the faded ink on the letters, the pattern of dust in corners. She examined the journal with a new focus. Granger had written about a long-standing feud between his family and another family in the region. The entries described disputes over land, arguments that had escalated over years, and moments when trust had been broken so deeply that reconciliation seemed impossible. Emily realized that the cabin was not just a house. It was a witness to decades of tension, a place where secrets had been stored and carefully guarded. As she explored the cabin again, Emily noticed small details she had missed before. There were marks on the walls, faint lines scratched into the wood, perhaps as a way for Granger to measure time or mark important events. In one corner, she discovered a small metal box hidden behind an old cupboard. Inside were more letters, photographs, and a collection of old maps of the surrounding mountains. The maps were marked with circles, notes in the margins, and paths that twisted through the forest. It was clear that Granger had spent a great deal of time observing the area, planning routes, and marking locations that were important to him. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. This was a man who had thought of every possibility, someone who had carefully prepared for events she could barely imagine. Emily spent the following days in the nearby towns, asking questions quietly and recording what she could learn about the families mentioned in the journal. Some of the names were familiar to local residents, others were long forgotten. She discovered that while much of the history had faded from memory, traces of old disputes still lingered. The townspeople spoke cautiously, wary of stirring memories that had been buried for decades. Emily understood that she was walking a delicate line. She had to gather information without upsetting anyone or drawing unwanted attention to herself. Yet every new piece of information added to her understanding, helping her see the bigger picture of what had happened in the mountains so long ago. One evening, Emily returned to the cabin with a sense of anticipation. She had traced several individuals connected to the old feud, some still living in the towns nearby. Using the clues from Granger's journal and the letters, she began to map the network of relationships, disputes, and alliances. Each detail brought her closer to understanding the reasons behind the secrecy. She realized that Granger's careful preparation was not just about protecting himself. It was about preserving knowledge, recording events that others had ignored, and leaving a record of a story that might otherwise be lost. The cabin, in its silence, was a testament to the life of a man who had chosen to live apart from the world while remaining deeply connected to it in ways most people could not see. As Emily examined the maps and letters, she noticed references to certain locations in the forest where events had taken place. One note mentioned a meeting spot near the old oak tree. Another referred to the clearing by the creek where decisions were made. Emily decided she would follow these clues, walking the trails and paths that Granger had mapped so carefully. Each step through the mountains felt like stepping back in time, retracing footsteps that had been taken decades earlier. She felt a growing connection to the past, a sense that she was uncovering not just a story, but the lived experiences of people who had walked, argued, and struggled in the very spaces she now explored. The forest itself seemed alive with history. Birds called from hidden perches, the wind whispered through the trees, and the soft crunch of leaves underfoot created a rhythm that matched the careful pace of her investigation. Emily found herself imagining the moments Granger had described in his journal, the disputes, the quiet observations, the cautious movements through the woods. She could almost see him stepping lightly over roots and rocks, noting paths and landmarks, ensuring that he would always know the way. Each discovery strengthened her sense that history was not static. It lived in places, in objects, in the memories carried by those who had survived. One afternoon, Emily came across a small clearing by a stream, exactly as Granger's notes had described. The ground was uneven, covered with leaves and moss, but there were subtle signs of past activity. Stones were arranged in a circle, and small depressions suggested that temporary structures or gatherings had taken place here. She knelt and examined the soil, noticing faint impressions that hinted at movement and placement of objects. It was a quiet, almost sacred space, a place where decisions had been made and perhaps secrets had been exchanged. Emily felt a deep respect for the care with which Granger had documented every detail. He had not only recorded events, but had left evidence that could be discovered by someone patient and observant enough to follow the trail. Emily also began to understand the emotional depth of the story. The feud, the tension, and the preparations for possible confrontations were not just about anger or fear. They were about human relationships, loyalty, and the consequences of choices made long ago. Granger's journal revealed a man who was deeply thoughtful, deliberate, and painfully aware of the impact of his actions. He had chosen to live in isolation not out of hatred, but out of necessity and a desire to control the circumstances around him. Emily realized that the cabin, with its hidden compartments and carefully preserved objects, was a reflection of his life, a life that had been shaped by conflict, intelligence, and a need to protect both himself and the story he carried. The deeper Emily went into her research, the more she realized that the past was never truly gone. The mountains preserved memory in their quiet ways. Every rock, tree, and path was a witness to events long past. She returned to the cabin multiple times, photographing, sketching, and taking detailed notes of every discovery. She even recreated parts of the maps, adding annotations based on what she had learned. Each addition made the story more complete, yet Emily knew that the narrative was still unfolding. She could sense that the next steps would reveal not just historical facts, but the lingering effects of choices made decades ago. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the forest floor, Emily sat in the cabin reading one of the more personal letters. The writer spoke of regret, sorrow, and a hope that someday the truth would be understood. It was a reminder that history is not only about facts, but about feelings, experiences, and the human desire to make sense of events. Emily felt a quiet determination to honor that hope. She knew that the story she was uncovering had the power to change the way the community understood its own history, and she felt a responsibility to handle it with care. Over the following weeks, Emily visited the cabin nearly every day. She cataloged the letters, journal entries, maps, and hidden objects, gradually creating a full picture of Granger's life and the events that had unfolded in the mountains. She reached out to descendants of the families involved, careful to approach with respect and sensitivity. Some were willing to speak, offering fragments of memory, while others were reluctant, fearful of reopening old wounds. Emily listened carefully, recording what she could, understanding that each perspective added a vital layer to the story. She began to see how the past had shaped present lives, how decisions made long ago still influenced emotions and relationships today. Through it all, Emily felt a growing sense of connection to Thomas Granger. She imagined his daily routines, his cautious movements, and his careful record-keeping. He had lived alone in the mountains, yet he had created a story that would outlive him. Emily realized that the cabin was more than just a building. It was a vessel for memory, a place where a life of complexity, struggle, and quiet heroism had been preserved. The dust, the maps, the hidden letters, and the journal entries were all pieces of a puzzle that she had been given the rare opportunity to solve. By the end of her second month in the mountains, Emily had compiled a collection of photographs, transcriptions, and notes that formed the first comprehensive account of Granger's life. She had mapped the forest trails, identified key locations, and documented every hidden compartment and object in the cabin. Her research had begun to attract quiet attention from local historians, who were fascinated by the depth and detail of her findings. Emily felt both satisfaction and a deep sense of responsibility. She knew that revealing the story required careful judgment, sensitivity, and respect for those who were still living and connected to the past. Emily's work had also changed her personally. She had grown more patient, more observant, and more aware of the subtle ways in which history lives on in the world around us. The mountains had taught her to listen, to watch, and to consider each detail carefully. She had discovered that history is not simply written in books or recorded in official records. It is preserved in spaces, objects, and the memories carried by people who experienced it firsthand. And in the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by dust, letters, and the lingering echoes of a life lived with vigilance, Emily felt that she had truly begun to understand what it means to uncover the past. As the weeks passed, Emily Carter realized that uncovering the full story of Thomas Granger's life meant stepping carefully into a world still shadowed by old tensions. While most of the local community welcomed her curiosity, she could feel subtle warnings in the way some people looked at her or quickly changed the subject when she mentioned certain names. It was clear that the events Granger had recorded were not entirely forgotten. Some memories were fragile, some resentment still lingered, and even the smallest hint of past conflicts could provoke unease. Emily understood that history was not always gentle. The mountains kept their secrets well, and she had begun to see that revealing them could bring discomfort or even confrontation. One morning, Emily returned to the cabin with her notebook and camera, determined to review all her findings. As she approached the small clearing near the cabin, she noticed movement among the trees, a shadow that seemed deliberate, not like the passing of an animal. Her heart beat faster, and she slowed her steps, careful not to make a sound. She could see a figure moving cautiously, watching the cabin from a distance. Emily ducked behind a tree, observing silently. Whoever it was, they seemed hesitant, as if unsure whether to approach or retreat. The tension in the air was thick, like the calm before a storm. The figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Emily with a growing sense of unease. She entered the cabin and secured the door, checking her surroundings carefully. The forest was quiet, but her mind raced with possibilities. Was someone aware of her visits? Had they been watching the cabin, waiting for her? Emily had expected that exploring the cabin and tracing the history of the families involved might attract attention, but this was the first time she had encountered a direct sign that someone was present nearby. She reminded herself to stay calm and not to let fear cloud her judgment. After all, she had come this far by observing, thinking, and respecting the delicate balance of past and present. That evening, she reviewed her notes and photographs. Emily began piecing together what could have led to the encounter she had experienced. Thomas Granger had written extensively about potential threats from those who still held grudges, and some of the individuals connected to the feud were still alive. It became clear that, while the disputes had existed decades ago, the emotions and memories had not completely faded. Emily realized she was dealing not just with history, but with living consequences of that history. The realization made her cautious but also more determined. She knew that uncovering the full truth required courage, patience, and careful planning. The next day, Emily returned to the nearby towns to speak with more residents, carefully asking about historical events without revealing too much of her own findings. Some residents shared recollections of the past, vague at first but increasingly detailed, as they realized she was sincere in her intent. They spoke of family disputes over property, disagreements that escalated in ways no one had expected, and moments when people had feared for their safety. Emily took careful notes, cross-referencing each account with the details she had gathered from the cabin. The consistency of the stories convinced her that the events described in Granger's journal were not exaggerated. They were real and had affected many lives. As she continued her research, Emily noticed a pattern. Certain locations mentioned in the journal appeared repeatedly in both the written records and oral accounts. These places, the clearing by the stream, the old oak tree, a ridge overlooking the valley, seemed to be points of significance where decisions had been made or confrontations had occurred. Emily decided to visit these locations, hoping to find physical evidence that would corroborate the stories. Each visit required careful navigation, as the forest had grown denser and some trails were nearly invisible. She moved quietly, respecting the space, aware that each step was a connection to the past. On one visit, Emily reached the ridge overlooking the valley, exactly as described in Granger's journal. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills, dense trees, and the distant curve of a river catching the sunlight. Yet the beauty did not diminish the weight of history she felt. She imagined Granger standing in the same spot decades ago, watching for signs of approaching visitors or threats, carefully noting movements and planning his next steps. Emily knelt to examine the soil and found faint depressions that suggested temporary shelters or resting places. She realized that every detail Granger had recorded, every mark, every note, was part of a meticulous observation of his surroundings. This man had lived in the mountains not only for survival, but to understand the terrain, the people, and the consequences of old conflicts. One late afternoon, while Emily was documenting the ridge, she noticed a group of people moving along a distant trail. At first, she assumed they were hikers, but their deliberate pace and the way they glanced toward the ridge suggested otherwise. Emily crouched behind a rock, observing silently. They seemed aware of her presence, though she remained hidden, and she realized that her investigation had attracted attention. The tension was immediate, a mix of fear and adrenaline. She knew she had to act carefully. Instead of confronting them, she quietly returned to the cabin using a less visible route, staying alert and mindful of every sound and movement. Back at the cabin, Emily reviewed her findings and made a plan. She decided to strengthen her safety measures, ensuring that she could continue her research without putting herself at unnecessary risk. She documented all her visits, noting every encounter and observation, and created a detailed map of the areas she had explored. Emily understood that the story she was uncovering had more than historical value. It was a story that connected the past to the present, showing how choices and events from decades ago could still influence people's lives. This awareness made her more cautious, but also reinforced her sense of purpose. The following days were filled with careful observation and research. Emily revisited the clearing by the stream, following the notes in Granger's journal closely. She found small, subtle signs of past activity, stones arranged deliberately, slight depressions in the earth, and a pattern of movement through the undergrowth. She realized that Granger had not only observed the physical environment, but had also created a system of markers and signals to help navigate safely. Emily felt a sense of awe at the precision and care that had gone into his preparations. The cabin and the surrounding forest were more than a setting. They were an extension of the man himself, reflecting his intelligence, caution, and resilience. One evening, as Emily was returning to her rental cabin, she was approached by a local elder named Samuel Hayes, who had lived in the area all his life. He had heard of her work and wanted to share what he knew. Samuel spoke carefully, recounting stories passed down through generations. He described moments of tension between families, incidents where trust had been broken, and events that had caused fear and uncertainty. Emily listened intently, recognizing names and locations from the journal. Samuel's recollections added depth to her understanding, showing how personal memories could complement written records. She realized that the human element, the emotions, relationships, and decisions, was just as important as the physical evidence she had been collecting. As Emily continued her research, she noticed subtle signs that some local families were uneasy about her presence. Conversations would shift when she mentioned certain places or names, and some residents seemed to avoid direct eye contact. Emily understood that revealing the story of Granger and the feud might disturb long-held peace. Yet she also felt a responsibility to uncover the truth, to document what had happened, and to ensure that history was accurately preserved. The tension between uncovering history and respecting the present made her approach each step with thoughtfulness and care. One night, Emily returned to the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose. She reviewed the journal entries that described moments of conflict, preparation, and careful observation. She realized that Granger's life had been shaped by anticipation and strategy, by the need to be aware of every possibility. His choices had been deliberate, informed by both fear and wisdom. Emily began to understand that the cabin itself was a reflection of his life, dust-covered, secretive, and carefully structured to hold and protect the knowledge he valued. The realization deepened her respect for the man and his story, reinforcing her commitment to uncover and share it responsibly. As the moon rose over the mountains, Emily sat by the cabin window, reflecting on the journey so far. She had traced paths, discovered hidden compartments, documented letters, and spoken with residents whose memories carried fragments of the past. Each discovery brought her closer to understanding Granger's life and the events that had unfolded. She felt the weight of responsibility, both to the story and to the people connected to it, yet the sense of purpose outweighed the fear. Emily knew that the story she was uncovering was more than history. It was a lesson about the human experience, about the ways in which choices ripple through time, and about the importance of careful observation and respect for the past. The following morning, Emily returned to the clearing one last time before moving on to the next stage of her research. She carefully examined every detail, the arrangement of stones, the depressions in the ground, the path leading deeper into the forest. She photographed each element and recorded her observations, ensuring that nothing would be overlooked. As she stood in the quiet of the clearing, she felt a connection to Granger that was both eerie and inspiring. It was as if his careful planning had reached across time to guide her, to help her understand the magnitude of what had occurred in the mountains. By the end of Part 3, Emily had fully entered a world where past and present intertwined. She had encountered shadows of the living past, understood the motivations and preparations of a man who had lived cautiously and strategically, and felt the lingering effects of choices made decades earlier. The cabin was no longer just a structure. It was a gateway into history, a living record of human experience, and a challenge for her to navigate carefully. Emily knew that the next stage of her journey would bring new discoveries and possibly direct confrontation, but she felt ready. The mountains had tested her patience, skill, and judgment, and she had risen to meet the challenge, absolutely. Here's the expanded Part 4 of The Cabin That Hid a Secret: Dust, Bullets, and Revenge. Written in simple English, engaging, fully safe, and around 1,600 words. It completes the story. Emily Carter knew that she had reached a turning point in her research. Over the past months, she had explored the cabin, uncovered Thomas Granger's journals, mapped the forest, and connected with local families. She had pieced together decades of history that had long been hidden in dust, wood, and memories. Yet, despite all her careful planning and study, she realized that history was not confined to the past. It lived in the people who remembered, the families who had been affected, and the land itself. Emily understood that the final stage of her journey would not only involve documenting what had happened, but also ensuring that the story was shared respectfully and responsibly. Returning to the cabin one early morning, Emily noticed a sense of calm she had not felt before. The sun cast a golden glow over the mountains, illuminating the trees and the small clearing nearby. Birds chirped softly, and the forest seemed to exhale after the tension of the previous weeks. She walked slowly to the cabin, careful not to disturb the peace, and reviewed her notes and photographs. The journal entries were neatly organized, the maps carefully annotated, and the letters transcribed. Everything she had discovered now formed a cohesive story of Granger's life, his careful planning, and the way he had navigated a world filled with tension and secrecy. Emily felt a deep respect for the man, understanding that his isolation had been both a choice and a necessity. As she examined the cabin, Emily noticed subtle signs that reinforced the significance of the place. Dust hung in the air, drifting over the old floorboards, and sunlight streamed through the cracks in the walls, highlighting the faint outlines of hidden compartments. Each object, from the maps to the small metal boxes, told a story of thoughtfulness, caution, and patience. Emily realized that the cabin was more than a home. It was a record of history preserved in silence. It had survived decades of weather, neglect, and the passage of time, and now it held the attention of someone willing to uncover its secrets. Emily decided it was time to return to the towns and speak more openly with those who had personal connections to the families mentioned in the journal. She approached each conversation with care, explaining her intent to document history rather than stir up conflict. Slowly, she began to gain the trust of the residents. They shared more details about the past, small family stories, moments of reconciliation, and recollections of Thomas Granger that had been passed down through generations. Emily listened attentively, understanding that the human perspective added depth and emotion to the historical record. These conversations revealed that, while the feud had caused tension, time and understanding had begun to heal old wounds. During her visits, Emily met an elderly woman named Margaret, whose family had been closely connected to the events Granger described. Margaret spoke of her memories with care, recounting moments of fear, moments of bravery, and moments when families had chosen to come together despite past disagreements. Emily realized that these stories were as important as the written record. They added color, emotion, and context to the historical facts she had uncovered. She carefully documented everything Margaret said, combining her words with photographs and notes from the cabin. It was becoming clear that the story was not just about Granger or the feud. It was about the resilience of people and the way they carried the past into the present. One day, Emily returned to the cabin to organize all her materials before leaving the mountains for a few weeks. She carefully placed the letters, maps, and journal entries in a secure folder, making sure each item was photographed and recorded. She walked through the cabin slowly, pausing in each corner to observe details she might have missed before. The hidden compartments, the faint scratches on the floor, and the dust-covered objects all seemed to whisper the story of Granger's life. Emily felt a sense of completion, knowing that she had uncovered the cabin's secrets and honored them with careful attention. Yet she also knew that the story was not just for her. It belonged to the families, the community, and the history of the mountains themselves. As she prepared to leave the cabin, Emily felt a quiet presence around her. She paused, sensing the weight of the past and the echoes of the man who had lived here so many years ago. It was as if the cabin itself was acknowledging her efforts, offering a silent approval for the care and respect she had shown. Emily stepped outside and took a deep breath of the fresh mountain air. The sun was high in the sky, and the forest seemed alive with light and possibility. She realized that uncovering history was not just about facts. It was about understanding lives, feelings, and the lessons that could be learned from the past. Emily decided to compile her findings into a comprehensive report, combining photographs, journal excerpts, maps, and oral histories from local residents. She wanted the story to be complete, accurate, and respectful. Over the following weeks, she worked tirelessly, reviewing each detail, cross-referencing information, and ensuring that the narrative was coherent and engaging. She wrote in clear, simple language, aiming to make the story accessible to everyone, not just historians. Her goal was to preserve the memory of Thomas Granger, the families involved, and the cabin itself, ensuring that the lessons of patience, caution, and understanding were passed on to future generations. As Emily prepared to present her research to local historians and the community, she reflected on the journey she had taken. She remembered the excitement of discovering the cabin, the thrill of uncovering hidden compartments, and the challenge of tracing historical connections through letters and oral histories. She also remembered the moments of tension, the shadow in the trees, the cautious glances from townspeople, and the subtle reminders that history can affect the present. Each experience had taught her the importance of observation, empathy, and careful documentation. Emily felt grateful for the opportunity to bring the story to light. When Emily finally shared her research with the local community, the response was thoughtful and appreciative. Residents were fascinated by the depth of detail she had uncovered, the clarity with which she had presented the story, and the respect she had shown for both the past and the present. Some families were moved to share additional memories, filling in gaps and adding personal touches to the historical record. Emily realized that the story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had been touched by the events, everyone who had lived in the shadow of the cabin, and everyone who had a connection to the mountains. The cabin itself became a symbol of history preserved and understood. While it remained largely untouched, Emily's work ensured that its significance was recognized. The mountains, once silent witnesses to tension and secrecy, now carried the story of a man who had lived with caution, intelligence, and resilience. The letters, maps, and journal entries had been preserved, and the oral histories of local families had added context and meaning. Emily felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that she had honored the past while helping the community understand and reconcile with it. As Emily prepared to leave the mountains for the final time, she took one last walk through the forest, retracing the paths Granger had described. She paused at the clearing by the stream, the old oak tree, and the ridge overlooking the valley, taking in the beauty and stillness of the landscape. Each location held memories, both written and lived, and she felt a connection to the people who had walked these paths before her. The mountains had taught her patience, observation, and respect for history. They had also shown her the importance of listening to objects, landscapes, letters, and people. Emily realized that understanding the past required more than research. It required empathy, care, and attention to the smallest details. As the sun set over the Appalachian Mountains, Emily felt a sense of closure. The story of Thomas Granger and the cabin was complete, preserved in photographs, notes, and oral histories. The families affected by the events had been included in the narrative, and the lessons of caution, resilience, and careful observation had been shared. Emily knew that the cabin would remain, a quiet testament to a life lived with vigilance and thoughtfulness, and that the story she had uncovered would continue to inspire and educate. In the final moments before leaving, Emily stood at the edge of the clearing and looked back at the cabin. The dust hung in the air, sunlight glinted off the windows, and the forest seemed to whisper in acknowledgement. She understood that history was never truly gone. It lived in spaces, objects, and people. The cabin had hidden its secret for decades, but now, thanks to careful observation, research, and respect, its story was no longer forgotten. Emily felt a quiet joy, knowing that she had honored the past while preserving it for the future. The journey had been challenging, filled with moments of tension, discovery, and reflection. Emily had learned the importance of patience, respect, and empathy. She had uncovered a story of human experience, showing how choices, actions, and relationships could shape generations. And as she walked away from the cabin for the last time, she knew that she had fulfilled her mission: to bring the story of Thomas Granger, the cabin, and the mountains to life, ensuring that their lessons would be remembered and understood.